Good evening. Good evening. All right, that was good. That was good. My name is Matt Rowell. I serve here as the Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, and I'm standing in tonight for Sister Peg Albert, who's our president. She's away this evening at a wake. It's my pleasure, distinct honor, to welcome you this evening to the 2019 William Isa Lecture Series talk, which will be given by our distinguished guest, Dr. Gabby Ahmadia. Dr. Ahmadia currently serves as the Director of Marine Conservation Science on the Ocean Conservation Team at World Wildlife Fund. And Dr. Tom Wasmer will introduce Dr. Ahmadia more fully in a moment. The William Isa Lecture Series is funded by a generous endowment which was gifted to Siena Heights by William Isa's uncle and Siena Heights graduate in the 1976 class, Darrell Isa, and his wife, Kathy. The endowment honors the life of William Lewis Chapin Isa, who died tragically in his early 20s. More on Darrell in a moment, but let me begin by saying a few words about his nephew, Will. A lifelong vegetarian and regular blood donor since he was 17, he loved all animals very deeply, and demonstrated this by working at the Shaker Animal Shelter and Woodbury Science Lab, where he was very fond of a ball python named Monty. In college, he observed canid behavior at Purdue University's Wolf Park, and wanted to return to work with the wolves, with which he had a wonderful rapport. Those who knew Will marveled at his ability to withstand the cold. He always wore sandals and short-sleeved shirts, and even the bitterest of winter days. Not a religious person, but a deeply spiritual one, he believed in other dimensions and universes. He devoured books on fantasy and science fiction, and always carried a book to read with him. He treasured his gifts, but always gave most generously of his time and money to the causes about which he cared. He loved his creature comforts, a nice glass of wine, tea, coffee. He interned, Thai food, there's more. Thai food, a luxurious bath, and of course he spent a fortune on hair care products. But he was deeply concerned about the environment. He interned in Washington, D.C. for Representative Dennis Kucinich, another environmental advocate. William's career goal was to be an environmental attorney, and at Case Western Reserve, he majored in philosophy, environmental science, and psychology, earning his degrees with honors. It is for Will's memory that this generous endowment was founded, and it is in Will's memory that this speaker series continues to bring highly respected scholars to our campus community. If you know Darrell, you will know that after graduating from Siena, he went on to do great things. He co-founded a company called Directed Electronics in 1982 and served as its CEO for many years. As a result of the company being one of the largest makers of automobile aftermarket security and convenience products, he amassed considerable wealth. According to Wikipedia, his net worth in 2014 was estimated at a little over $436 million. So our Brad did well for himself. In 2001, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives, serving districts in North San Diego County, California. He served the House for 17 years, 4 of those as chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, that was 2011 to 2015, before announcing that he would not seek re-election in 2018. He has since renewed his interest in serving and is now running for California's 50th congressional district in the 2020 election. As a lawmaker, Darrell was outspoken about environmental issues, but not in the way one might think based upon the nature of the lecture series that his generous gift supports. Again, quoting from a Wikipedia citation concerning his political positions on environmental issues, I quote, "ISA rejects the scientific consensus on climate change and has stated there is no scientific consensus on climate, and that scientists have falsified data. Before the 2010 election, Darrell pledged that if elected, he would probe ClimateGate, which refers to the hacked climate research unit emails that climate change denialists falsely asserted showed scientific misconduct and fraud by climate scientists. ISA called President Obama's unwillingness to investigate ClimateGate unconscionable and an abdication of responsibility. In 2009, he voted against the American Clean Energy and Security Act. He opposes federal regulation of greenhouse gas emissions. In February of 2017, he voted to repeal a rule that required coal companies to restore streams and mined areas to their pre-development conditions. The League of Conservation Voters has condemned ICE's actions related to the environment, stating, as chairman of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, Congressman Issa is not only denying climate change, but also actively impeding federal action, pledging to hold hearings on the politicization of science and calling for greater oversight of EPA's regulations of greenhouse gases. I bring this up not to put Daryl's political stances on trial, but rather to highlight the fact that life is complicated, and people are complicated. And I believe that this case highlights one of the most critical roles that universities play in our society. Universities provide us a public venue for the confrontation of difficult and complex issues about which well-meaning people may have dramatically different views and opinions. Universities provide us a space where facts and the interpretation of facts can be presented, discussed, and debated. That is what we've gathered here for this evening. We're very grateful to the ICES for this generous gift and for the life of their beloved nephew. We're thankful for your attendance tonight, and I personally hope that the lecture sparks your curiosity and causes you to think critically, challenging yourself and others to have honest and respectful conversations about issues for which you agree or perhaps disagree. And with that, please allow me to introduce Dr. Tom Wassmer, one of our distinguished professors in the biology department here at Siena Heights University, who will further introduce you to our speaker, Dr. Gabby Ahmadia.
Good evening. Okay, so Dr. Gabby Ahmadia, is Director of Marine Conservation Science on the Ocean Conservation Team of the World Wildlife Fund. She has expertise in tropical marine ecology, community-based conservation, area-based management monitoring, design and implementation, and impact evaluation of marine conservation interventions. So very practical, especially in the time of the climate crisis that really will threaten the lives of many more people in the near future. Gabby is focused geographically in the Western Pacific Ocean, also known as the Coral Triangle, and coastal East Africa. So quite a ways from here, but Gabby is going to bring that message home as well. Originally from Hawaii, Gabby's experience ranges from monitoring and eradication programs for invasive plants to develop rapid vulnerability and resilience assessments for coral reefs. So quite a stretch here, botany to zoology, terrestrial environments to marine environments. She has worked for over 15 years on marine science and conservation issues now. Gabby's undergraduate degree was from, I actually didn't write it down, sorry. Humboldt State, yeah, in California. Okay, Humboldt State, so Northern California. And the master's degree from the University of Western Florida was in marine ecophysiology. And in 2012, Gabby completed her PhD in coastal and marine system science from Texas A&M in Corpus Christi, Texas, investigating factors that structure coral reef fish assemblages. And that's where you and our dean might share some common research interests. Okay, so that's enough for introduction. Please welcome Gabby to her presentation.
So how is the volume there? Is that working? Okay. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining me tonight and giving me the opportunity to share a little bit about what I do, where I think the field of conservation is headed, and just get to chat a little bit more than I get to at work, because everybody's just tired of listening to me talk. And thank you for that introduction. We've been talking for a while. I'm thinking about this presentation, and how to bring some of the work we do on a global level to what you can do in Michigan. So I'm going to start off with a little doom and gloom, but I am going to lift it up. But unfortunately, that is the world we're living in. But there are solutions, and there's things that we can do, and if we act now, we can change the trajectory of the planet. And I'm also going to say I am getting over a cold, and so forgive me if I cough or if I lose my voice a little bit during this presentation, but I'll try my best. But I might need to take a quick break for water. So that's my quick disclaimer. So if you look at the headlines in media, this is what you see, right? You see dying coral reefs. You see fires in the Amazon. Food security is a threat because of climate change, and places are getting dry and farms aren't working. You're hearing about these Arctic heat waves, glaciers are melting, sea levels rising, biodiversity populations, it's just on the decline, giraffes are on the decline. So what you hear is just pretty doom and gloom. It's hard to find much positive in the world of conservation. But we are trying to change this narrative. We are winning a lot of what we say battles in a lot of these places. There are places where we're winning, and we are seeing good things happening in the environment. So don't let the media always get you down. Take a chance, read it, read the nuance in there. We do need to think about the urgency of this issue, but also don't be so discouraged to feel like there's nothing you can do. Boop. Has anybody heard of Earth Overshoot Day? Yep, a couple of you guys. So today, this year, we reached Earth Overshoot Day on July 29th. What this means is we basically used all the resources on Earth and its ability to regenerate itself. So within that year, that's, well, one Earth, that's the time that Earth can regenerate itself. But we hit it on July 29th. Right now, I just looked at where we're tracking right now. So right now, we're at 1.3 Earths. And by the end of the year, we'll be at 1.7 Earths. So that means we're not allowing the Earth enough time to recover. We're using so many resources and we're having so much impact on the environment that the Earth is not able to replenish all of its resources that it provides to us. And this is declining. We're hitting this a little bit earlier every year, but we want to change this, right? We want to start changing it so we actually hit one Earth at December 31st. And I'm going to give you an overview of what's called the IPBES assessment. So you may have heard some of this stuff in the headlines, where the UN, the United Nations, commissioned basically a report and bringing together, it's like a couple hundred experts from all over the world to compile information and looking at the state of the environment and the current trends. So this is almost the first of its kind. This is a really unique report that was released this year. And what it shows is, we are making a lot of positive changes in GDP, so how they measure the growth of the economic growth of different countries. So so there's less poverty in a lot of places. There's less malnutrition. There's less poverty. So there's a lot of positives happening for humans around the world. There's still a lot of gaps to be to fill, but there's even less disease. But what that also means is we're also growing in population and we're having much more impact on all these resources. So these first, I don't have an arrow, but these like top corner ones, those are just showing population going up, world population going up, and even the growth, economic growth of countries that are going up. But then all of these other ones are also showing how we're consuming more and this drastic increase of how we're placing demands on resources and the environment. It is becoming a globalized world. This is the reality of it. But a lot of these choices are being made putting the economy first before the environment. There are ways to address both of these issues, but it tends to be money wins. And so how is this impacting all of these environmental conditions on Earth? You see things like carbon dioxide increasing, we all know this. All these greenhouse gases are increasing. We're seeing temperatures increase, oceans are acidifying. That's crazy, right? Like we're actually having so much impact on the environment, and this ocean is so vast, but we're still changing the environment so much that oceans are becoming more acidic. And this causes all these things that have their skeletons made out of calcium carbonate to start having impacts on their development and reproduction. We're seeing things like, what else do I want to, I'm not going to talk about all of them. A lot more land use, so domesticated land use. We're having much more of an agriculture footprint. Agriculture is expanding. It's not always being done very well. There's much more nitrogen being put out in the air. And yeah, I'll stop there. I'm not going to go through every single one. But you can see the point of it, right? There's all of these negative trends happening. And this is a really nice global distribution of consumption. And so what consumption is looking at imports and exports of these different countries and like essentially looking at what each country's ecological footprint is. So if you take a look at the US, yay, we're winning, but not really. It actually means we have the highest ecological footprint. And so we are the biggest consumers. This is not like per population, it's per individual. So individuals are having the biggest consumption. So we're importing, we're using things. And you can see it's these richer countries, right? Australia, Europe. And then you see, these countries in the South, Africa, South America, these have a lot less of a consumption rate. But I'm going to come back to this later. So remember this. Look who's driving all the consumption. It's these Western countries. And what's happening? A little more doom and gloom. This is an index, the Living Planet Index, WWF. My organization, which I forgot to talk about, actually releases this report every year, and it shows declines of population. So they compile all this data, and they show what the trends look like. Not looking good, right? We're still seeing declines, maybe stabilizing a little bit, but we've seen, I think, 60% loss of species and populations. And what's driving this, I talked a little bit about this, but what they did was link all of these different drivers. So what's driving these threats and what is driving the loss of these different animal type of groups. So you can see like habitat loss and degradation, species overexploitation. So in the ocean, that'd be fishing. On land, it would be using animals for wild-caught animals or poaching. Pollution, I don't need to explain that. Invasive species, I think that's actually pretty relevant to Michigan lakes. And climate change. You can see a lot of this is just driven by habitat degradation, loss, and exploitation. It's kind of interesting because you do hear a lot about climate change, right? So sometimes everybody thinks climate change is the only thing impacting our species, but there's a lot of other things happening here. We are clearing forests, we are developing in all of these places and pristine areas, and this is leading to losses of habitat for all of these species. And you can see exploitation is also a big one. And then we have, pollution and climate change, which are all incredibly important, and climate change is going to continue to be more and more important as it gets worse over time. All right, a few more facts, and then we'll get to the positive part, I promise. But on a global scale, the area of minimally disturbed forests, so these are fairly pristine forests, has declined by 92 million hectares between 2000 and 2013. I tried to convert it to football fields or something that you guys could wrap your head around, and I think I came up with something like 175 million football fields. That's how much has been cleared. It's hard to even fathom, right? But that's how much pristine forest has been cut down in 13 years. And this one's near and dear to my heart. The Earth is estimated to have lost about half of its shallow coral reefs in the past 30 years. A lot of this is due to just habitat destruction, exploitation, but now climate change is really starting to impact coral reefs. Coral reefs are kind of the canary in the coal mine when it comes to climate change. It's one of those ecosystems that's really sensitive. So as ocean temperatures rise, there's all these little symbiotic algae that live within corals, And these coral, these little algae don't like it when it gets really hot. And so they expel out of the corals, and that's actually how the corals are getting energy, right? We all know photosynthesis. So they're photosynthesizing. It's this nice little relationship with corals, but then they're gone. Corals turn white. People are like, oh, it's so pretty, but it's not really that pretty because it signifies that the corals are really stressed. And if that hot water sticks around for a long time, then they die. And then they turn brown, and it's not so pretty. And so if current trends continue, this is actually a paper I was on, and I don't always like how they quote it, but it's that 90% of world's coral reefs will start to experience this bleaching. So most corals around the world are going to start really experiencing this if we don't get climate change under control. And this is related to that other slide you saw, but we've seen a 60% decline in the size of populations of mammals, birds, fish, reptiles, and amphibians, over the past about 50 years. That's 60% lost. That's incredible. Not in a good way. Out of 1,500 fish species recorded as being caught, just 10 make up 1/3 of today's global catch. So they're just hitting some of these species. So sometimes you hear about bluefin tuna. They're setting these massive nets. One of the first times I really experienced how big that impact was is I spent a little time in Micronesia, which I think maybe you've seen. But you go out to these little islands in Micronesia, and then you see these massive, massive fishing boats. They're basically like cruise ships. They have helicopters on them, multiple helicopters, so they're going out and looking for the tuna. And you can just see how that can actually impact a big ocean. Because the ocean seems so vast, right? But when you have these big, huge industrial fishing boats that are out there chasing every last tuna, they just have no chance. So that's just one example. And just they're being exploited everywhere. We're not managing fish catch. U.S. actually does a pretty good job at managing a lot of its fisheries, so we're doing pretty well in that regard. But maybe we could do more on the international front. And we don't always import sustainable fish. We do a good job managing our own fisheries, but we import a lot of fish that isn't managed as well. And so this is a distribution. This is a map showing a distribution of all these different declines. So you can see this is like the Indo-Pacific. Remember that map we talked about? Do you mind using the microphone? Can you not? You can't hear?
Yeah, it's good. Let me see. Does it
I can.
Does it get louder? Try.
Okay, is that any better? Yeah, I have another. I'm very mic'd up here. I can talk into the. Do you have the regular mic?
Yeah, let's get this on.
Or that one?
Oh yeah, with this one you can walk around. Yeah.
Sorry. Hold on a second.
Hello. Hello. Test. Is it on?
No. Is that one?
Okay. Hello. Test. Oh. There you go.
Is that better? Okay, great. Sorry about that. I didn't realize you couldn't hear me. Okay. Closer? Ooh. This feels very intimate. Okay, so this map is showing these different geographies or these different realms and the declines that you see in those species across these different realms. And so you can actually see there's much more declines in the south in a lot of these poorer countries, right? Remember? But where is all the consumption coming from? And consumption is driving so many of these biodiversity patterns. So there's a lot of inequity in biodiversity loss and climate change. And what's happening is the Western world doesn't see these impacts as much. This is where we're seeing a lot of the declines, and this is where it's really touching down on people. But we're driving a lot of this. And so it's something to think about. People don't really connect those things together because we don't see it as much. But we're a wealthier country. We have more potential to adapt. But not always the case. There's even studies that are showing in the US some of these impacts are unevenly distributed and impacting poorer communities, such as air pollution and water, right? The issue in Michigan. And so there's a lot of inequities and social inequities in conservation. And so this moves on to this slide, which is, ooh, that's weird because, all right. Conservation and health. And so linking the nature and how it impacts people. I'm finding this really distracting, so I'm going to switch to this. Sorry. Can't. I'm gonna. It's just. It's in and out. Sorry. I want to turn it off. Okay. Is that better? Okay. So there's a strong connection between the environment and people. And we don't always make those connections. So environment can impact health quite a bit. It can impact mental health. There's a lot of studies out there now showing that even if you spend 20 to 30 minutes in nature, it doesn't have to be something super fancy, but even a walk in the park can reset your brain. You know, there's a lot of issues with mental health these days, right? But this is one way that is showing a more natural way to connect to the environment and be healthier. Diet is linked to the environment, getting diverse nutrients in all these different places. This is more relevant in a lot of these places where their primary source of food is like fish or wild-caught meat. And so sometimes this is their essential source of protein. Disease is very linked to conservation and nature. I actually was at a whole seminar last week where they talked about the link between the environment and some of these pandemics, such as Ebola, and places where we have much more better governance in place and the political situation's better and they're managing their environment, they're able to also manage some of these pandemics better. It's also an important part of people's livelihoods. Ooh. It's giving me all kinds of trouble tonight. So things like tourism are really important. In the US, like Florida, it's a huge economy for them. Where I'm from, Hawaii, tourism, people are looking at the environment, right? They're there to visit the reefs and see the pristine, pretty environment. So a lot of people get their income. Other places, like places where I work in Indonesia, fishing is their primary livelihoods in so many of these communities. And it's not only how they're putting food on their plate, it's also how they're getting income so they can, buy a roof for their house. And the last thing is it's often a part of people's culture or spiritual part of their being, right? In a lot of these places, there's really strong connections with the environment in lots of different ways. And so when you lose the environment, you lose this connection. In a lot of the places we work in, there'll be these rules set up. Things are sacred. So in Madagascar, there's these trees or these places that are sacred that they just don't touch because of this respect for the environment. In Indonesia, they have really similar things, and actually across Indonesia, they even have different ways that they call it. But they have these traditional resource management. They used to do this a long time ago, and they had no problem managing their own resources. It's just when we started to have these expansive population growth and increased demand on resources is where we really started to deplete them. And so one of the things we do is try to bring in some of the culture and back into how we manage these resources. In the last couple of slides, I'm showing this connection. This slide I find is a little bit overwhelming, but it does show all of these benefits from nature. So it shows this provisioning, so that's things like that we could directly get from nature. So food, medicine, fresh water, raw materials for building things. These regulating benefits from nature. And so, helps climate regulation. Trees are great, right? They're great regulators of the environment. Other things like supporting, so they help with photosynthesis and energy, which is where we get our food from. And then there's some of these cultural things I spoke about. And what's nice is this is starting to be recognized. So there's these Sustainable Development Goals, and this is part of the United Nations. This is where governments make commitments towards how they develop a more sustainable future. So there's commitments, there's a lot of money and resources, and if countries try to track towards these goals. Before, these used to be called the Millennium Development Goals, and it was just about development and lifting countries out of poverty. But now they've changed these to Sustainable Development Goals and actually lifting people out of poverty with the environment, because they're like, wait a second, we need to do these things together. They shouldn't be different. And this ties in to this next slide, which is the evolution of conservation. So conservation, when this concept came out, you used to just think about species, this wilderness, these national parks, so places that people could go enjoy, walk around, hike. But then it started to switch a little bit. So in the early 1980s, it was like, oh, humans are creating havoc on the environment. And so it was like, remove all humans from the environment, and let's get these really strict protected areas set up. Let's restrict people's access. Let's stop fishing. And so it's just really focused on getting this disconnect. It was just focusing on conservation of the environment. And this is like what happened in a lot of these countries, like in Africa, and they set up these parks, but they were set up really top down. Communities weren't involved. And then in 2000, they're like, maybe this really isn't working, because they weren't getting support from the people, right? People, this is where they lived. It'd be like telling you need to just move out of some of these places that maybe you had lived, or your family had lived, for generations. I'm like, well, okay, so nature does provide these benefits to people. And they started doing a lot of economic evaluations. So they started putting numbers on the environment and try to convince governments that was the way to protect them. And so it started to become shifting, so there's this connection between nature and the environment. And now we're in this stage, I'm calling it, 2010, where it's actually together. It's people and nature. And how do we develop conservation interventions where both can coexist? Realizing that both probably need to compromise a little bit to achieve a vision together. But if you have them separate, we're not getting to where we need to go. You saw those slides earlier. We're not getting there. Something has to change. And so it's become much more of a people-centric approach to conservation. I wouldn't say everybody's there. There's still a spectrum of these approaches, but I would say a lot of these organizations, such as the World Wildlife Fund that I work at, and many of the other conservation NGOs are starting to change. And we're thinking about conservation differently. We're thinking about how people interact with the environment and how they can be part of it. And can we develop sustainable practices? Maybe it does mean a little bit of logging, but if we can protect the rest of the forest as a concession, then that's maybe these things we need to think about. So now I'm going to take you to the solutions part and a little bit more of like where we are having some positive change around the world. I'm going to talk to you about some stuff in Madagascar, some mangrove work in Madagascar. Then we're going to go to reefs in Indonesia, or actually maybe elephants. I'm going to talk about elephants. I'm a marine biologist, but I'm going to tell you about some of the work we're doing on elephants because I think it's really cool. And then we'll bring you back to Michigan. But I just wanted to give you a flavor of how we're doing conservation in all of these different places and how it takes all these different diverse people involved and how conservation's changing. Right now we need financial people, we need technical people, we need innovators, we need the biologists, but now biologists are becoming less relevant. We need psychologists, we need all of these different folks coming together to help think about how we do this conservation better. So first I'm going to take you to Madagascar. Madagascar is the 4th biggest island in the world. You may not have known that. I didn't realize that until recently, and it's off coastal East Africa. When you think about Madagascar, this is what people typically think of. They think of lemurs, they think of this like really exotic wildlife, or they think of this movie, which is totally misleading because I always have to tell my little nephews that lions do not live in Madagascar, neither do zebras or giraffes, but these little lemurs do, that's accurate. I think they get displaced from a zoo or something. But that's kind of what people think traditionally about Madagascar, even in the conservation world. But what I discovered about Madagascar recently is that it has incredible coastlines, and these coastlines are full of mangroves and coral reefs, and there's a strong dependence of coastal communities with these ecosystems. But in Madagascar, similar to the trends we've seen elsewhere, we see fish landings are increasing. So they're catching more fish, but they're having to work a lot harder to catch these fish. So catch rates are decreasing. So this means they're actually traveling a lot further, they're having to use more technology, they're spending a lot more time at sea to catch the same amount of fish. So what does that mean? There's a lot less fish in the sea. They're depleting this resource. Habitat loss and degradation is happening. This is from development, and for a number of reasons that a lot of this decline in habitat for mangroves, which they chop down for firewood, or coral reefs, there's experiencing some change from climate change. And this is a tough country to work in because 70% of the population lives below the poverty threshold. It is a poor country. And if you visit some of these communities, you know, where I went was the north, and so apparently I think it's a richer part of Madagascar. But you do see some pretty depressing things. You go along, we're driving out to sites, and you see kids digging through trash that's burning, and you see them spending all day chopping up rock. I don't know why they're chopping up rocks, maybe for building materials, but you go out in the morning, they're chopping rocks, and they're still out there 4 o'clock in the burning sun chopping rocks. These are places we work in. That is the reality of it. And there's a lot of threats. We go into these places and there's so many threats to manage. There's no one answer. Like we have to think creatively. We have to think of where are the best places to leverage resources and change the trajectory of what's happening. So I talked a little bit about overfishing. You know, they're opening rights up. They sell their fishing rights to Chinese vessels right now. You know, instead of protecting it and making money from their own fishing economy, they are short-sighted and selling their rights to their fishing grounds. Habitat destruction is happening. As I said, this is from like fuel and charcoal, from coastal development. Land-based pollution, so they're clearing land upstream. It causes more sediment in the water, and the sediment actually impacts the coastal ecosystems and has negative impacts. So you might think of it, just thinking of like lakes, you get a lot of erosion here, right? That's kind of a similar concept. There's these climate impacts, you have these increasing ocean temperatures, rising sea levels, there's more storms there. They never had any hurricanes or anything, and they just had one a couple years ago, and just wiped out these villages. And also the climate change is impacting the people in their farming. There's these areas in Madagascar that are really dry. And because everything is drying up in these places, they're leaving and they're migrating. And so now you have these migrating populations in these coastal communities who don't even know what to do. They're violating rules. They don't know what, and causing a lot of issues in communities. And so we're dealing with that social conflict. So it's not to overwhelm you, but it's just to share the complexity of these issues. Sometimes conservation organizers just get criticized that we're not getting anything done, but this is what we're dealing with. You know, sometimes it's trying to deal with just trying to manage this real complexity of issues in really poor places. But we do some great things, and these communities are leading the charge on a lot of this work. So a lot of times we work with communities on empowering them, or just giving them the knowledge to be able to figure out how to manage their resources. They often recognize the decline, but they're not always sure what to do about it. You know, they're worried about putting food on their plate. They're worried about sending their kids to school. And so this is a mangrove restoration project. This is a community getting together for 2 or 3 days and reforesting a place that they had cleared themselves, but now they're going in and they plant all these mangroves, which grow pretty fast. And this increases in fisheries. Shrimp are really important there, and they've already seen increases in shrimp from increasing the mangrove forest. And the mangrove forest also provides firewood. I talked about this, but now they have an area where they just sustainably harvest the mangroves, so they can use that for firewood instead of clearing out these whole tracts of land. And these storms that come in, now when they have these mangroves, it helps protect them from storms. You hear a little bit about that with some of these storms that come in and hit the east coast of the US, where you have these more intact natural coastlines. This is where it absorbs a lot of that storm shock. In Florida, where we have more of these mangroves in place, it absorbs a lot of it. These are natural solutions. We are cutting down natural solutions and building concrete walls, which don't even provide, a tenth of the benefits that these natural systems do. But these communities are recognizing, and they come together. We teach them how to grow the mangroves. It's actually pretty easy. The mangrove little propagules, which is those things they're planting. And they come together, and it's pretty amazing. But I talked a lot about poverty, right? So these places are poor. And we can't just deal with these conservation issues. We also have to think about these broader challenges where they just are trying to have some kind of livelihood. And so this is where I talked a little bit about conservation's changing. We're trying to work with development agencies. We're trying to work with health to solve holistic issues for these communities dependent on these resources. So for example, this is a beekeeper. I don't know all the bee terminology, but now they have a box where the bees can go instead of a hive, and they raise honey, which they can now sell to the market. And so now this is a more consistent source of income that they have. When I asked them how they used to do it before, they said they used to go into the forest, run down, hit a hive, run away, hope they didn't get stung, and then try to go return later. But now they have a safer, better way of managing and harvesting honey. Other things we do is just really simple things that you just don't think have that impact, but it's providing vaccinations to chickens. But now, because we're providing vaccinations to chickens, these guys have lots of chickens. I got to go into one of the coop. They're very proud of their chickens, and so they can sell it to the market. And so that sometimes means they're not depending on fishing as much, not depending on those coastal resources. So chicken farming, you would have thought conservationists are helping with chicken farming. We are. And this is another way also to empower women in communities. For example, I had a lovely conversation with a woman who was now raising ducks. And she was able to sell the ducks, and she had duck eggs. And she told me now that because she has this other source of income, she can send her kids to school. So this is this more holistic world of conservation, and what we have to do to help alleviate the impact on the environment, on the pressure on the environment, so that it can be restored and provide all those benefits they used to. All right, so that was a nice story about mangroves. Now I'm going to talk about elephants. Wildlife poaching and the ivory trade. This is a pressing issue, and you hear a lot about it in the US. This is actually something that's a bipartisan movement that different members of Congress and the Senate have come to support, because it is such an issue of this ivory trade. And so fueling all of this ivory trade, so the ivory is like from elephants or rhinos, is the demand. And so there's a huge demand in Asia, largely from China, also Hong Kong, Singapore, Thailand. So that's one big part of the issue, right? It's these other countries, these wealthier countries, that are driving demand in these poorer countries. So this ivory trade, it threatens iconic species and livelihoods of people, and it undermines national and regional security. So a lot of these places, it is illegal to be, I think most places actually, it's illegal to be poaching, right? But so now you have all these illegal poachers running around, and they're often armed with scary guns and machine guns, and then there's local communities that are living alongside this. And there's rangers in the communities that are set up to protect a lot of this wildlife. But what is it? The stat is 100 rangers are killed annually every year protecting wildlife. So in Africa, that's an astonishing number. It's a really dangerous world of poaching. So there's 3 pillars of work that WWF does in conjunction with lots of other partners. You're getting a WWF lens because I work with WWF, but I will say there's lots of other groups working on these and tackling these issues alongside us. So the first one is stop the trafficking. So that's all of that, the movement of all the ivory around the world, stopping the demand for it. So stopping the demand in these Southeast Asia and China, and stop the poaching. So that they're focusing on these 3 different elements. And so for stopping the trafficking, a lot of this is just enabling, setting those enabling conditions. So this may be policy, getting capacity building. It's having brokering deals between heads of state. So for example, this is in 2015, the Obama and the Chinese president made a commitment to enact nearly complete bans on the import and export of ivory. So they worked together to come up with these resolutions around ivory. And then in the December recently, China took the step of closing its legal domestic ivory market. So that's a big win. So now you have this legal imports are no longer allowed. So it takes these heads of states working together and brokering deals to get those policy conditions in place. So that's one piece of the puzzle, right? So you gotta work at these international policy forums, you gotta work with national governments, but that doesn't stop it. So it's changing this demand, right? How do we get people to change their behavior around it? So some of the things they've been doing is marketing and advertising and trying to hit different people in these regions to change their attitude towards consumption or buying all these trinkets and ivory products. And often it is starting to shift. They're starting to see, particularly the younger generation, is changing their attitude towards ivory and no longer wanting it. It's a little bit harder to change that cultural generation. This is something that they really value. But now, working with behavioral people, psychologists, financial, commercial marketing. So those are the group of people tackling this challenge, right? Totally different than like what you think of as traditional conservation. But they're working with folks in these different regions to tackle this demand issue. And so this last few slides are focusing on that poaching issue. Talked about all of those poachers, all these illegal poachers running around. And this is where some cool technology comes in. So this is a region in Zambia in Africa where there's a lot of poaching that's occurring. And this is a lake. So this is an image of a lake. And apparently, yay. It showed you the fancy technology first. So this is an image of a lake. And apparently what happens on this lake is it's closed in the evening. So it's closed when it's dusk hits. And so nobody's supposed to be on the lake. So if somebody's on the lake at night, it's probably a poacher or someone up to no good. But to track them, now they've installed these like super fancy cameras that have infrared and they can track people moving across the lake at night. And then they have these female rangers who are patrolling all of this. So they can see all of this that's happening on the lake. And then they're able to report it. And so since they've had this technology in place, they've already caught several poachers using it. So this is a really nice way of using technology to support conservation. Another magic white box. Okay, so now we're gonna go back to coral reefs. I gave you my elephant example. I stepped away from the marine world. But now back to coral reefs and a little bit of work that's been happening in Indonesia. And another positive story. And I'm gonna share with you a little bit of work on marine protected areas in Indonesia. So marine protected area is essentially like a park on land, like a national park that you might go visit. And marine protected areas are set up so they might have different restrictions in place. They're not all set up the same, but what they're trying to do is reduce impacts on the environment. Sometimes they can be completely no-take, so nobody can fish, nobody can do anything on these marine protected areas. But in Indonesia, they tend to be set up so that people can use traditional fishing gear, but we get out the commercial fishers, those big fishing boats that are in there. Also, they try to set it up around traditional management systems. I talked a little bit about that earlier. So the importance of building in culture into modern management approaches. And so it's kind of combining these two worlds to think about how we do this to better support these parks. So many of these places don't have the resources they need to manage them, right? And so you need communities on board to be supporting this. You want the communities to not be violating the rules. You want them to be not fishing in these no-take zones, to let fish to recover. But if we don't have them on board as well supporting these areas, then there's just going to be a lot of violation of rules. There's actually been a lot of studies that have shown that there's so much, they also call it poaching in the marine environment when you're fishing in these places you're not supposed to, when you don't involve the whole communities. And so now when we do work to develop these marine protected areas, you'll work with governments, we work with the private sector, so getting companies involved, maybe that are developing aquaculture or other fishing techniques, big fishing companies, and then working with local communities. So you kind of have to work with all these different levels to get everybody engaged in these park management. Indonesia's massive. It has a ton of islands. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this one region that's dotted, which we call the Sindabanda Seascape. We like to brand everything with names at these NGOs. I don't know why. But this is what we've been calling the Sindabanda Seascape. And so you can actually see these dots are all of these different places we work along in Indonesia. And this is a lot of water. Like I think that Banda Sea, if you see it right in the middle, I think that's the size of Texas, to give you, some perspective. 5,000 small islands just in that one area. 1 million hectares of coral reefs, tons of mangroves, 27 million people. It's actually a pretty densely populated country. And a lot of these places, there's a lot of coastal villages. And a lot of these coastal villages are very dependent on these resources. Some of these places, it's like 90% of the people are dependent on fishing for putting food on their plate and also getting their income. And so this is another example of another complicated way we do conservation, but how you have to take all of these different approaches. So we work on these really important habitats. Remember, habitats are really important for biodiversity. Habitat loss leads to lots of biodiversity loss. So we tend to try to focus, instead of doing species one by one, we try to focus on the habitats themselves. We have to think about small-scale fisheries. Some people say, treat fish as wildlife, that they shouldn't be caught. But that's not the reality in these places. These people are dependent on fish. Like, that is their livelihood. We can't tell them to not fish. It'd be like telling a farmer in the US to not farm. That doesn't go over very well, right? So we have to figure out ways to work with them so there's sustainable fishing in place. So we use these things like marine protected areas or these locally managed areas, which is a less formal way of using traditional management systems. And at the heart of this is community conservation. In all of these places we work, we have communities that are at the heart of all of this work. This is the only way we're really going to provide benefits to them and make them stewards of the environment. I'll quickly go over this slide. So just to show you, good things are happening. It's not perfect, but Indonesia has established almost 20 million hectares of marine protected areas as of 2017. One of the few countries to actually meet their commitments. They're not all well managed, so one of the things we do is work on some of these places to help manage them better, whether it's training the government, working with communities. But we have seen in these places we work in improvements in communities' food security. So they feel more secure about the food they have. We have all these questionnaires, all our social scientists go out and do all these questionnaires, but it shows that they have more food security, which is huge. And decreases in social conflict. And so this is a good indicator showing the well-being of the community. All right, and now I'm going to start wrapping up, bringing you back to Michigan. And what's happening in Michigan? There's actually people in this room who probably know a lot more than I do. I moved to Michigan 4 months ago, but I've been trying to listen to what people in the community have been saying. But you guys noticed really high water in the lakes this summer, right? Wasn't so fun. Jetties, the little docks were gone. It's sitting on the lawn. Or we did anyway. And our things all washed away, and now people are having to build walls and retainer walls, and it's really expensive. But a lot of this is speculated to be due from climate change. There's more precipitation, there's unpredictable winters, and it's just projected to be more. We can't predict what's going to happen because it's just more weather extremes. And that's what's happening. This used to be more predictable before, And now it's just becoming to this state where we don't know what's going to happen because there's so much dynamic things happening in the environment. It's happening faster, it's happening more extreme events. I'm not trying to scare you, but there's these linkages, and sometimes maybe you're like, why is there high water? You know, I feel like there's a lot of old wives' tales about it. But I did do quite a bit of reading because I was curious myself. Things like invasive species in lakes, right? You have the Asian carp coming in, disrupting all these ecosystems, and I heard they're just moving through all the lakes. Human health impacts. I was astounded to read 10% of people in Michigan have asthma, and that's 25% higher than the national average. So there's definitely some air quality issues in Michigan. That surprised me, but apparently it has to do with a lot of the coal factories and these things that have led to lots of air pollution. But as a positive, apparently those rates are getting better as we move to more renewable energy. But another reason, right, to move towards more renewable energies, it's not just about the state of the environment, it's about the state of people's health. The last one, pollution in waterways. This is due from so many different things. But one is just basic things like lawn fertilizer. We know there's industry, we know there's different things happening that are all leading to all these things in our waterways. You know, I know some of these places now you can't even eat the fish, right, in the lakes because they're so polluted. So Michigan is feeling impacts as well, right? You guys are having declines in certain systems and in these pristine lakes, you know, that Michigan is well known for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can do. I saw a great, I don't know, it was a meme or something going around, but it was just saying that everybody just needs to do a little, right? It's not just a few people doing extreme things, right? Everybody doesn't need to be a vegan. You know, everybody doesn't need to bicycle. But if everybody, you know, takes little steps to help reduce their impact on the climate and the environment, like as a whole, as a collective, we can start making positive changes. Things like drive a smaller car. People like big cars in Michigan. I lived in Texas before, and Texas was bigger. You know, think about it next time you're buying a car. Do you really need that big truck that's a big guzzler? Also impacts the roadways, has more, and then you have to replace the roadways. You know, there's all of these things just to consider. It doesn't mean you need to drive one of those tiny little cars, but you know, some people need it for work, and it's totally reality, and if it's part of your lifestyle, that's fine. And I mean, people may not like me for that comment. But food waste is another one. This is where America wins again. We waste 1/3 of our food. That's, what are we doing? 1/3 of our food. So this is a lot from people just throwing out food in the fridge. Restaurants, right? We order all the stuff at the restaurant and we just can't eat it all. Buffets are a really big culprit of this. But this also has a huge environmental footprint. Agriculture, right? We know agriculture has a footprint. But this is a really easy measure to just be a little more conscientious about what you're ordering or how much food you're buying at the grocery store. Because we are not doing well in this. Although I saw Kroger is doing some big food waste things, so that was kind of nice to see. So it just does seem like some of the grocery stores and stuff are coming on board. Consumer choices, you can make choices about food. It doesn't mean everybody needs to become a vegan, but maybe you commit to eating a little less meat. We know meat has a big impact on the environment. Maybe it's just one night less a week? Anyway, getting to the end of my talk. Maybe it's just a little bit less, right? Maybe you look at those blueberries and they came from Argentina. Do you need to buy the blueberries from Argentina? I don't know. Maybe not. Maybe you can buy some local fruit and local produce. So just little things to think about, just being a little more conscientious about these things. Another one is fast fashion. Not buying something that's just going to last a year and it's going to go in a bin. Go to vintage stores. You know, that's kind of hip, right? I don't know. But maybe, you know, saving your money up a little bit more, just buying a few less clothing articles, but stuff that's going to last a little bit longer. This last one I like is wild yards. As I was raking the leaves, I was like, this seems really dumb. The newcomer to Michigan, I was like, this is a lot of leaves, so this kind of blows me away. But then I was reading these articles about why you shouldn't rake your leaves. I was like, yes, because it's good for the environment. But apparently all the leaves are a good environment for birds and butterflies, and they actually are a natural fertilizer, so you don't have to use all that lawn fertilizer which is going into the waterways. So I thought this is, I was like, oh, I don't need to but you might need to do the front for your neighbors so you don't end up being that neighbor. But it is, one of those things where you're like, why am I doing this? You can plant natural, native plants, less water consumption, right? And these tend to be better for pollinators. You always hear about birds and bees. And so native plants are better for many of these organisms. Engage in civil society. Don't stick your head in the ground as much as you might want to sometimes, as much as I want to in my job sometimes. Just inform yourself. Just keep yourself aware of these different issues. Look at how candidates are voting or what their positions are on these different environmental issues. We get to vote. We have that right. We get to influence the trajectory of what we think is important. If you think environment is important, maybe you want to support those candidates. You can join or support environmental groups. And the last one is keeping yourself informed. It's our responsibility. It's, again, as I say, sometimes you just want to stick your head, in the lake in Michigan, but it's actually better just, you don't have to know everything, but it's good to understand nuance of some of these issues. It's not always black and white. And my last one as a scientist, trust the scientists. We don't go to conferences and debate about climate change. I've never been to a conference where scientists were debating about climate change. I don't know, it kind of blows my mind that that's what's projected in the media. Scientists, we're not paid a lot, to publish any of this stuff. I'm sure I'm speaking to people who, are in the science field and stuff, so you guys know this. But most of what's out there is accurate. I would say be careful about the media and how it portrays science. As someone who speaks to the media about science and see how they construe some of these facts that I say, or how they take things out of context. Sometimes it is good to read different sources in the media. You don't always have to go to the scientific paper, but think about it, just critical thinking. And I would say most of the scientists out there are not being paid by, I don't know who they say we're getting paid by, but I haven't been made any of those offers. But thank you so much for letting me talk about all of these different things today. It was a really nice opportunity to share. And I guess now we're going to open up for questions.
Don't be shy. Okay.
Oh, no. Oh, wait. What microphone is that? Does it say? Does it have a number?
Wireless 3.
It's on mute. Okay, try. Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentation. I know this might be a bit off topic from your work, but I'm just curious if you could comment at all about what the status of the debate, if any, in the conservation community might be with respect to global population and the increase in global population. It seems to me that all of these different effects of humans on the Earth are, the population is just a sheer multiplier of all of our activities. Is there a position that some conservation groups have toward, look, if there's just fewer of us on the planet, it reduces all of these other constraints are, it's a fact. Is there a debate about that at all, or how to address that? I know it's a touchy issue.
You're not the first one to bring that up. Of course, it's one of those nuanced things, and I'm a scientist, I'm not going to give you a straightforward answer. But a lot of these places, there are the resources to sustain these populations. 1/3 of food wasted, that could sustain a lot of these growing populations. And there are ways to sustainably develop it in a way that won't have massive impacts. That being said, there are a lot of people working on family planning, and there are some conservation organizations actually I think we've worked in certain places like Nepal, but in Madagascar there's a group that is working with family planning groups in some of these places. So it's something that we are aware of, and talking about working across these different sectors such as health development, and family planning is part of that. Yeah.
Thanks, Gabby. I've got a question about the NPAs that you know about in Indonesia. My experience in NPAs is that they have very positive effects, but one of the major issues is being able to enforce the NPAs. And so in Indonesia, how they tackle that. For example, in areas of the Caribbean that I know NPAs are established, there's rarely anybody who can actually go out and patrol to make sure that the NPAs have their effect. So how does that work in Indonesia?
Yeah, it's tricky. Often patrol boats don't have fuel, right? So these boats sitting on land, and it is trying to, there's a couple ways to tackle this. Is we work with the governments, on ensuring that they develop budgets for, to be able to do some of this work. In one part of Indonesia, they've actually established a huge trust fund. So basically it's like you have a big endowment, and then there's just the interest, and the interest helps pay for the management of the park. Yes, we think the government should be paying for this, but in a lot of these places, governments aren't investing in this. They like to invest in other things, not always the environment. And so it's thinking about ways to resource these places adequately. And then it's that community angle. We actually did a study out in one of these regions where we showed that building capacity of the community to help manage our park and doing education and such of those things really reduce poaching rates. And so it wasn't just like the enforcement part, but it's also the incentive part and the education part that's a way of reducing poaching. But it's a big challenge as well.
How did you come to work for the WWF?
A lot of things fell into place. I did a lot of field work in Indonesia and the Pacific during my PhD, so I spent several years out there, and they happened to be advertising for a position working in Indonesia and marine protected areas. So there wasn't actually that many people who had been doing that, and so I was a nice candidate. Walking around the hallways today, I was like, oh, this reminds me of my biology degree, because I had a very traditional biology degree. I didn't study any of this. I learned a lot of this stuff on the job, to be honest, a lot of conservation science on the job. And it's just really, just getting yourself out there, volunteering, getting as much experience as you can. Those are the people that tend to, work for these organizations. It's also saying, somebody was talking about the Peace Corps. We actually have a huge amount of people that worked in the Peace Corps that now work for WWF or work for lots of these organizations.
Being a psych student, I was just wondering, because I know you said that psychology is really big in WWF. Do you actually hire psychologists, or?
We've had interns looking at behavior science, and I know they've done like contracts and consultants. I don't know if we've actually hired anyone at this moment, but it's changing as people are seeing behavior science and psychology as part of how we change people's attitudes. So there's this one organization that's really interesting called RARE. They're based in Washington, D.C. as well, and their whole focus is on behavior change of communities. And so that's an organization that'd be interesting to look at as what their model is and how you bring in a lot of these different social scientists and psychology into conservation approaches.
So I'm going to ask two questions. One, where is your favorite site and working and why? And also, how much of the local governments have you had to deal with when you're doing this site work?
Oh, I love it when people ask me that question. For reefs and the diversity of reefs, it has to be Indonesia. Those reefs are like no other. I think we were talking about the Caribbean versus Indonesia, and Indonesian reefs are, I always forget the stats, but how many, there's like 10 times more fish species and hundreds of more coral species, so they're just, it's incredible. And the second question was, see, now I already forgot.
There was dealing with the local government.
Yes.
To do site work.
So often I'm not appropriate to be dealing with the local governments. We have people on site, so usually people's of wherever country we're working on that deal with it. If it's often sensitive, right? So we work a little bit behind the scenes on capacity building and technical capacity and kind of linking it to global policy, but we're not the ones communicating. Yeah. And I'll say one more thing, it's changing. That's another thing that's changing in conservation as well. You hear a little bit about parachute science or colonial conservation. And so it's not us coming in as the saviors, right? It's like, actually, how do we help just support local expertise and governments to do the work, right? It's not us coming in. Yeah.
So when you're out on the reefs, how would you go about like tracking change, like just in one day of being out there? What are some things that you would do?
It's hard to track change if you don't know what was already there. So what we do is we try to set up baselines in a lot of the places we work on. This is one of the fun parts of my job that I used to do and I don't get to do anymore. But we essentially do laying out measuring tapes on reefs, and you're looking at the status of the coral and whatever's on the bottom, and then you're like counting fish and how big they are. And so you swim along transects, or it's a measuring tape at these different reef sites, and you go back to them year or every couple of years. And then we also do, this might be a little too nuanced, but we also look at places where we're not working and track those changes as well, and you can compare those changes. So maybe you see a decline in a marine protected area, but it's small, and you see a huge decline outside. That actually means the MPA is having a positive impact. So that's one of the things we do with our monitoring, is we actually try to design our experiments so we can actually look at impacts of these interventions.
I ask what would you think is the biggest challenge on the sites? Is it climate change, politics, corruption? What would you say?
Political will. Yeah, and corruption. Yeah. We work in lots of places where the government is providing very little support. Yeah.
Political will is almost an international unhappiness, right?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is James, and I want to say welcome. As a scientist and somebody that keeps in the know of this, I'm a social work major. How do you do your self-care to keep from going crazy?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's funny because there was a study, I think it was just published in Nature, that talked about how scientists are coping with this. I try to have other hobbies, and I try to have a work-life balance. There are people who I think it does really impact their mental health. But it's tough. I was talking about climate change and impacts the other day, and I just had to stop myself because it was outside of work, and I was going down a dark hole, and sometimes you just have to bring yourself out. And then also focusing on those bright spots.
So I guess if there are no further questions, and we can adjourn. And if you want to approach Gabby more in a personal way, we are sticking around a little bit longer. Thank you.